They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but to me, it is a strict contract. When my father raised a $5,000 glass of wine to humiliate me before 200 guests, he did not know he was standing on land he no longer owned. He called me a loser. I smiled, not with submission, but like a creditor collecting a debt. Do you believe one signature can erase a 100-year legacy? Just listen. My name is Richard Johnson, and as I killed the engine of my battered 2008 Ford F-150, it gave a final, violent shudder that rattled my teeth before falling into a wheezing silence. The truck was a rusted beast covered in the red clay dust of a construction site I had visited earlier that morning, and it looked like an open wound against the pristine backdrop of the Sterling estate. I had parked it intentionally not in the designated valet area, where the attendants would have likely hidden it behind a hedge, but right on the edge of the manicured Kentucky bluegrass, the front tire digging a deep, muddy scar into the perfection my father paid $20,000 a month to maintain. To my left was a silver Bentley Continental. To my right, a vintage Porsche 911 in a shade of black so deep it looked like a hole in the universe. And there, sandwiched between these monuments of engineering and excess, sat my truck looking exactly like what they thought I was: trash. I stepped out the heavy door, creaking loudly enough to turn heads 50 yards away. The air in this part of Virginia always smelled different to me. It did not smell like pine or earth. It smelled of old money, manicured hedges, and the distinct metallic scent of ozone that seems to surround power lines and powerful people. This was not a family reunion. The invitation might have said, "Annual Sterling Family Gathering," but everyone here knew the truth. This was a political fundraiser, masquerading as intimacy. It was the 40th anniversary of the Sterling Group, and my father, Arthur Sterling, was using the occasion to remind the political elite of Virginia that he owned the ground they walked on. As I walked toward the main entrance, I caught the eye of the head of the valet service. He was a young man new to the staff, and he looked at me with a mixture of confusion and professional disdain. He started to step forward, likely to tell me that deliveries were made at the rear entrance, but an older security guard placed a hand on his chest. I recognized the guard. It was Thomas. Thomas had worked here for 30 years. He knew exactly who I was. And judging by the pitying sneer on his face, he also knew exactly what I was: the disappointment, the failure, the son who broke the mold by falling out of it and landing in the mud. He did not salute. He did not nod. He simply watched me walk up the driveway, his eyes tracking the dust on my work boots as if it were radioactive fallout. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, a harsh, gritty sound that seemed too loud for the polite murmurs drifting from the terrace. I was wearing a pair of khaki trousers that were fraying at the hem and a simple navy button-down shirt that I had bought at a discount store 3 years ago. It was clean, but compared to the Italian silk and English wool surrounding me, I might as well have been wearing a burlap sack. I reached the massive oak double doors of the manor. They were open, revealing the grand foyer that had haunted my childhood nightmares. It was a cavernous space dominated by a crystal chandelier that cost more than most people would earn in 2 lifetimes. But the centerpiece was not the light fixture. It was the painting. Hanging above the grand staircase was a 10-foot portrait of Arthur Sterling. I stopped for a moment to admire the audacity of it. The artist had captured him perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. He stood in a 3-piece suit, one hand resting on a globe, the other holding an architectural blueprint. But it was the face that drew you in. It was the smile. It was a wide, toothy expression that projected confidence and benevolence to the casual observer. But if you looked closer, if you knew the man, you saw the truth. It was a shark smile, dead in the eyes, predatory in the mouth. It was the smile of a man who would eat his own young if it meant securing a better interest rate. "You actually showed up." The voice came from my right, smooth and practiced like a radio host announcing the weather. I turned to see Edward standing there. My older brother. The golden boy. He was currently running for mayor, a stepping stone, to the Senate seat my father had already purchased in spirit, if not in law. Edward was wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that fit him so well it looked like a second skin. He held a flute of champagne in one hand, his grip loose and confident. "Edward," I said, keeping my voice flat, "you look expensive." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, just enough to assert dominance, a trick our father had taught us both when we were 6. The difference was Edward had listened. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my scuffed boots, with a grimace of distaste. "I am surprised the security let you in looking like that," Edward said, his voice low, so the nearby guests wouldn't hear the venom. "This is a black tie event, Richard, not a monster truck rally." "I must have lost the memo," I lied. "Besides, I figured nobody looks at the landscaping architect. We are supposed to blend in with the shrubbery, right?" Edward sighed, a theatrical exhalation that signaled his immense burden in dealing with me. He offered his hand. It was a reflex, a political instinct he couldn't turn off. I took it. His palm was soft, almost damp. It was the hand of a man who had never held anything heavier than a pen or a cocktail glass. "Just do me a favor," he hissed, squeezing my hand slightly before letting go. "Do not get drunk. Do not start talking about your little conspiracy theories or your sad little life. There are potential donors here, key stakeholders. If you embarrass me tonight, Richard, I will make sure you never work in this county again. Not even mowing lawns." "Mowing is nice," I said, wiping my hand on my pants. "It is honest work. You should try it sometime." Edward rolled his eyes and turned away, already scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. "Just stay in the corner," he threw over his shoulder. "And try not to touch the hors d'oeuvres with those dirty hands." I watched him go, blending seamlessly into a group of men who were all laughing too loudly at a joke that likely wasn't funny. I felt a tap on my shoulder. "Oh, Richard." It was Sarah, my sister. She was draped in a silver gown that glittered under the lights, looking like a disco ball that had gained sentience. Her face was a mask of flawless makeup, highlighting cheekbones that I was fairly certain she had paid a surgeon $5,000 to enhance last winter. She looked at me with the tragic expression one might reserve for a 3-legged dog. "Hello, Sarah," I said. She reached out and pinched the fabric of my shirt between 2 manicured fingers, as if checking for lice. "Is this cotton blend?" she whispered, horrified. "Richard, honestly, you knew about this party for 6 months. You could have at least rented a tuxedo. There is a rental place on 4th Street that is very reasonable. I could have sent my assistant to arrange it." "I am comfortable, Sarah," I replied. "Besides, rentals smell like other people's desperation." She sighed, shaking her head so that her diamond earrings caught the light. "You are so stubborn. Just like Mom. Look at you. You are making us look bad. People are going to think we do not take care of our own." "Do you?" I asked. The question hung in the air for a second, sharp and cold. Sarah blinked, her carefully constructed facade cracking just for a millisecond before she plastered her smile back on. "Do not start," she warned, her voice dropping an octave. "Not tonight. Dad is in a mood. The merger rumors have him on edge. Just go get a drink. Stand by the ficus plant in the corner. It hides the stains on your pants." She patted my arm, a condescending, pitying pat, and floated away to greet the wife of a bank president. I was alone again in the crowd. I moved through the room, a ghost haunting the living. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter who looked at me with open suspicion, probably wondering if I had sneaked in through the service entrance. I took a sip. It was tasteless, just like everything else here. I found a spot near a marble pillar where I could observe the room. It was a sea of fake smiles and calculated gestures. 200 people, and I doubted there was a single ounce of genuine affection in the entire hall. They were all here for the same reason, to kiss the ring of Arthur Sterling. And then he appeared. The crowd parted instinctively like the Red Sea, but instead of Moses, it was my father. Arthur Sterling walked into the room with the stride of a man who believes gravity is a suggestion rather than a law. He was 65 years old, but looked 50. His hair was silver thick and perfectly styled. His tuxedo was bespoke, cut to hide the slight paunch of age, and emphasize the broad shoulders of authority. He was laughing at something a senator was whispering in his ear. His eyes scanned the room, cataloging every face, every potential ally, every potential threat. And then his gaze landed on me. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. I stood there in my construction clothes, holding my water, looking straight into the eyes of the man who had sired me. I waited for a reaction. Anger, disgust, even disappointment would have been something. But there was nothing. His eyes slid over me as if I were a piece of furniture, a lamp, a coat rack. He did not frown. He did not pause. He simply looked through me, erasing my existence with a blink, and turned his attention to a wealthy real estate developer standing 3 feet to my left. He extended his hand to the developer, flashing that shark smile, and launched into a story about zoning laws. I was invisible. To him, I was not even a variable in the equation anymore. I was a zero. A younger version of me, the Richard from 20 years ago, would have been crushed. He would have wanted to scream, to throw his glass against the wall, to demand to be seen. But the Richard standing there tonight felt something else entirely. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction settling in my chest. I slipped my right hand into my pocket. My fingers brushed against the cool, brushed aluminum surface of a USB drive. It was small, no larger than a stick of gum, but it weighed more than the entire building we were standing in. It contained terabytes of data, forensic accounting records, emails, recorded phone calls, shell company registrations. It was the roadmap of a criminal empire built on fraud, intimidation, and theft. He ignored me because he thought I was powerless. He thought the worst I could do was embarrass him with my poverty. He had no idea that the loser, son the landscape architect, who played in the dirt, had spent the last decade landscaping the ground beneath his feet, preparing it for a sinkhole. I looked at Arthur Sterling, who was now clinking glasses with the senator, his head thrown back in laughter. He looked like a king holding court. He looked invincible. "Enjoy it, Arthur." I whispered to myself, the words lost in the din of the party. "Drink the wine. Shake the hands. Bask in the light. Because this is the last meal of the emperor." I took another sip of water. It still tasted like nothing but the anticipation that tasted like blood and iron. The night was young, and the debt was due. I checked the cheap plastic watch on my wrist. It was 8:15. The presentation was scheduled for 9 o'clock. 45 minutes. 45 minutes until the end of the world as they knew it. I leaned back against the pillar, watching the beautiful, terrible people dance. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly at home in the Sterling mansion. Because for the first time, I wasn't the victim. I was the executioner. As I stood in the shadow of the marble pillar, my gaze drifted from the man who called himself my father to the woman who had given birth to me. Evelyn Sterling sat on a velvet chaise lounge near the orchestra, a glass of Chardonnay trembling slightly in her manicured hand. She was smiling, but it was the fragile, brittle smile of a woman who was terrified that if she relaxed her facial muscles, her entire world would shatter like cheap glass. She was wearing a diamond necklace that likely cost more than the house I currently lived in, yet she looked destitute. Seeing her there, so small and defeated in her finery, dragged me back. The sounds of the string quartet faded, replaced by the suffocating silence of 20 years ago. I was not always Richard Johnson. I was born Richard Sterling, the second son, the spare heir, the anomaly. while Edward was outside playing lacrosse and learning how to bully the housekeeper's son. I was in the attic sketching. I drew bridges. I drew skyscrapers. I drew escape routes. I had a sensitivity that Arthur Sterling despised. He called it a defect. To him, empathy was a software bug that needed to be patched out of the system. I remember the day the defect became a terminal diagnosis. I was 16 years old. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and rainy. I had been summoned to Arthur's private study, a room that smelled of leather, expensive cigars, and fear. On his mahogany desk lay a copy of the SAT answer key. He slid it toward me with the casual indifference of a man passing the salt. He told me that he had arranged for a proctor to look the other way. He told me that I needed a perfect score to guarantee my admission to Harvard Law, to follow the path he had paved with gold and corruption. All I had to do was memorize the sequence, a BACD. It was so simple. I pushed the paper back. I told him no. I told him I wanted to earn my score. I wanted to be an architect, not a lawyer. I wanted to build things, not twist words. Arthur did not yell. He did not hit me. That would have been too passionate, too human. Instead, he stood up, walked to the door, and locked it. He turned to me, his face a mask of absolute disappointment. He told me that honesty is a luxury for the poor. He said that in the real world, the only truth that matters is the one you can force others to believe. He kept me in that room for 12 hours without food or water, lecturing me on the mechanics of power. He broke me down, not physically, but spiritually. He made me realize that, to him, I was not a son. I was an asset. And I was underperforming. 2 years later, the final break happened. I had won a full scholarship to a prestigious architecture program in Chicago. I was ecstatic. I brought the acceptance letter to dinner, thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, he would be proud that I had achieved something on my own merit. Arthur tore the letter in half before the soup was served. He told me I was going to law school or I was going to the street. He gave me an hour to decide. I did not need an hour. I went upstairs, packed a single duffel bag with my clothes and my sketchbooks, and walked out the front door. I left behind the trust fund, the sports cars, the summer homes, and the Sterling name. I took my grandmother's maiden name, Johnson, as a shield. I wanted nothing to connect me to the poison running through Arthur's veins. My mother, Evelyn, stood in the hallway as I left. She was weeping, clutching her silk robe. I waited for her to say something. I waited for her to tell Arthur to stop, to defend her son, to show 1 ounce of the maternal instinct that bears are supposed to have. She said nothing. She just handed me a roll of cash, her eyes darting toward the study to make sure Arthur wasn't watching. She was trying to pay me off to soothe her guilt with currency, because she could not afford the price of courage. I dropped the money on the floor and walked out into the rain. The transition from prince to pauper was violent. I had no credit history, no references, and no safety net. The first year I worked as a day laborer on construction sites. I mixed concrete until my hands bled. I carried lumber until my back screamed. At night, I slept in the cab of a beat-up truck I had bought for $500, parking in Walmart lots, and showering at the YMCA. I remember one Christmas Eve 3 years after I left. I was eating instant noodles that I had cooked with hot water from a gas station coffee machine. The truck was freezing. The heater had died a week prior. I was huddled under a scratchy wool blanket reading a discarded newspaper I had found in a trash can. And there they were. On page 6 of the Society section, the Sterling family Christmas gala. Arthur, Edward, and Sarah were raising glasses of champagne, surrounded by senators and judges. They looked radiant. The article mentioned that Arthur was heartbroken over his estranged son Richard, who had tragically succumbed to drug addiction and mental illness, forcing the family to cut ties for his own good. I sat there in the cold, staring at the lie printed in black and white. It was brilliant. Arthur had not just disowned me. He had destroyed my reputation to protect his own. If anyone asked why the Sterling boy was mixing concrete, the answer was already planted. He is a junkie. He is crazy. Do not listen to him. The pain of that moment was not about the cold or the hunger. It was the isolation. I realized that my entire existence up to that point had been a transaction. A family is supposed to be a sanctuary, but the Sterlings were a corporation. I was a bad investment, a division that was losing money, so the CEO had liquidated me. The rage kept me warm that night. It fueled me. It drove me to work harder, to learn the trade, to study at night. I went from mixing concrete to framing houses, from framing to managing sites. I started seeing the patterns in the chaos the same way I used to see buildings in my sketchbooks. But the knife twisted deeper 5 years ago. I had been doing well enough to rent a small apartment. I kept tabs on the family, mostly to ensure they were staying out of my life. I found out through a contact at the hospital that my mother was secretly battling a severe autoimmune condition. The treatments were experimental and not covered by insurance, and despite their wealth, Arthur controlled every penny. He was refusing to pay for the best specialist in Switzerland because he deemed it unnecessary expenditure for a condition that wasn't immediately life-threatening. I had saved $40,000. It was everything I had, the seed money for my own contracting business. I didn't hesitate. I set up a shell corporation, a fake charity, and routed the money to my mother's personal account with a note saying it was a grant for her health. I thought I had saved her. I thought for once I could use money for good, unlike my father. 6 months later, I saw a photo of Arthur in a business magazine. He was wearing a new watch, a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime. I knew watches. I knew the value. It was worth exactly $40,000 on the gray market. The article quoted him boasting about his investment prowess. He told the interviewer that he had recently made a shrewd short-term trade using some idle capital his wife had lying around in a forgotten account. He called it found money. He had taken the money I sent to save his wife's life and bought a watch. And my mother, the weak, terrified creature that she was, had let him. She had likely signed the transfer papers just to keep the peace, just to avoid a confrontation. That was the moment the last ember of love died. That was the moment Richard Johnson, the architect, died, and the man who stood here tonight was born. I realized that you cannot save people who are in love with their chains. You can only break the person holding the leash. I looked at Evelyn now, 20 years later. She was older, her face pulled tight by surgeries, her eyes glassy with sedatives. She caught my eye across the room. Her mouth opened slightly. She recognized me despite the rough clothes, despite the years. Panic flickered in her eyes. She looked quickly toward Arthur to see if he had noticed, then back to me. She raised a finger to her lips, a silent plea for me to stay quiet, to not make a scene, to not ruin the illusion she had sacrificed her soul to maintain. I did not hate her. Hate requires energy, and she was not worth the calories. I felt a profound, heavy pity. She was not a participant in the crime. She was the evidence. I turned my gaze away from her and focused on the stage where Arthur was shaking hands with the governor. The anger that had once burned hot and wild had cooled into something far more dangerous. It was now a precision instrument. The time for being the victim was over. The boy who cried in the locked study was gone. The young man shivering in the truck was gone. The son who tried to buy his mother's health was gone. The creditor was here. And the interest rate on 20 years of suffering was going to be astronomical. I touched the drive in my pocket again. It was time to show them that honesty is indeed a luxury, one that they could no longer afford, but one that I was about to serve them in bulk. Most people in that ballroom looked at my hands and saw calluses born of shovels and cement mixers. They saw the rough, scarred knuckles of a manual laborer, and they made a comfortable assumption. They assumed that because I worked with my back, I did not work with my mind. They assumed that my education ended the day I walked out of that house with my duffel bag. It was a comforting lie for them, supporting their worldview that class and intelligence were inextricably linked, that I was where I belonged in the dirt, while they floated in the clouds. They were wrong. For the last 10 years, while I was framing houses and pouring foundations by day, I was building something far more complex by night. I had always been obsessed with structures, with how things stand up and why they fall down. In construction, you learn that a crack in the drywall is rarely just a crack. It is a symptom of a shifting foundation. I began to apply that same logic to the financial structures behind the buildings I worked on. I started coding. I spent thousands of hours in public libraries teaching myself Python and R, devouring data on market trends, zoning laws, and foreclosure rates. I developed an algorithm. I called it the stress test. It was designed to predict real estate project failures, not by looking at the market hype, but by analyzing the invisible variables, supply chain delays, contractor litigation histories, and subtle shifts in local political influence. It could spot a doomed skyscraper 6 months before the first beam was even erected. 5 years ago, a major technology conglomerate in Silicon Valley bought the exclusive license to my algorithm. The payout was 8 figures. The day the money hit my account, I was eating a tuna sandwich in the cab of my truck. I stared at the balance on my phone screen, $72 million. I did not scream. I did not buy a Ferrari. I finished my sandwich, went back to the job site, and finished laying the brick patio I was working on. I did not want the lifestyle. I wanted the leverage. With that capital, I founded RJ Holdings. It is a ghost firm. No website, no flashy headquarters, just a registered agent in Delaware, and a terrifying reputation in the world of distressed assets. We specialize in buying bad debt. When a company is gasping for air, when the banks are circling like sharks, I am the one who swims up from the deep. I buy the debt for pennies on the dollar, and suddenly, I own the company. I have spent the last half-decade dismantling incompetent management teams and restructuring failing businesses. I am not a builder anymore. I am a surgeon for dying corporations. And 2 years ago, my diagnostic gaze turned toward the one patient I had sworn to ignore, the Sterling Group. It started as a morbid curiosity. I saw a news report about Edward's mayoral campaign, noting the lavish spending. I knew the family business. I knew the profit margins of their current projects. The math did not work. You cannot spend $3 million on television ads when your flagship mall project in Richmond is 40% over budget and 6 months behind schedule. I ran the Sterling Group through my algorithm. The result came back in bold red letters: critical structural failure imminent. I dug deeper. I spent nights poring over public records and permit filings. What I found was a hollow shell. The Sterling Group was not a business. It was a Ponzi scheme dressed in a tuxedo. Arthur and Edward had been cannibalizing the company to fund their personal ambitions. The private jets, the galas, the campaign donations. It was all being paid for by stripping the assets of the company. But the smoking gun was the debt. To keep the lights on and the champagne flowing, Arthur had maxed out every line of credit from reputable American banks. When they cut him off, he turned to the shadows. He had refinanced the entire Sterling portfolio, including the very mansion I was currently standing in the downtown headquarters, and the rights to all future developments, with a bank called Vantage Capital. Vantage Capital was an offshore lender based in the Seychelles, known for high interest rates and loose morals. They were the lender of last resort for desperate men. Arthur had signed a deal with the devil using the family legacy as collateral. Then fate handed me a loaded gun. 8 months ago, Vantage Capital got caught in a massive international money laundering scandal. The SEC and Interpol raided their offices. Their assets were frozen, and they needed liquidity fast to pay massive fines and legal fees. They were desperate to offload their loan portfolio. I saw the opening. I had my lawyers contact the liquidators for Vantage Capital. I used a series of shell companies to mask my identity, posing as a nameless, faceless investment group. I offered to buy the sterling debt package, a face value of $150 million, for $45 million cash. Vantage Capital didn't blink. They took the deal. The ink dried 3 months ago. The transfer was finalized. I sat in my small apartment holding the deed to the Sterling mansion in my hand. It was a surreal feeling. Technically, legally, and absolutely, I owned my father. I owned the roof over his head. I owned the ground under his feet. Every time he slept, he was sleeping in my house. Every time Edward gave a speech about fiscal responsibility, he was doing it on my dime. But I didn't stop there. I needed to be sure. I needed to know if this was just incompetence or malice. I hired a private investigator, a former FBI forensic accountant named Miller. He was expensive, $500 an hour, but he was worth every cent. Miller dug into the internal communications of the Sterling Group. What he found made me sick to my stomach. It wasn't just bad business. It was criminal fraud. Arthur had set up a network of consulting firms registered to dead people. He was funneling company money into these firms for services rendered, services that never existed, and then moving the cash into offshore accounts to hide it from the IRS. The worst part was how he covered his tracks. When the auditors asked questions last year, Arthur didn't take the blame. He pinned it on his loyal employees. Miller found emails where Arthur and Edward conspired to frame the company's chief financial officer, a man named Henderson who had worked for the family for 25 years. They planted false evidence to make it look like Henderson was embezzling. Henderson was fired, stripped of his pension, and is currently facing 5 years in prison. Arthur washed his hands of it and went to a golf tournament. That was the moment any lingering doubt I had evaporated. Standing there in the ballroom watching Arthur charm the room, I felt a strange sense of detachment. For a brief moment, the old Richard, the boy who just wanted his dad to look at him, whispered in my ear. He asked if there was another way. Could I just reveal myself, show them I was successful, pay off the debt, and demand an apology? Could I be the bigger man and save them? I looked at Arthur. He was laughing, his head thrown back, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a young congressman. He looked like a predator who had just eaten a gazelle and was already scanning the horizon for the next kill. If I saved him, he would not be grateful. He would hate me for it. He would take my money, rewrite history, to make it seem like he had mentored me into success, and then he would go right back to destroying lives. He would do to me what he did to Henderson. He would do to the city what he did to this family. A predator does not change its spots just because you feed it. I reached into my pocket and touched the USB drive again. It was cold against my fingertips. This wasn't just data. It was a guillotine blade. The drive contained everything. The transfer of debt ownership proving I was the sole creditor. The foreclosure notices that I had filed under seal with the court last week, the evidence of the shell companies, and the frame-up of Henderson that Miller had uncovered. And most importantly, it contained the trigger. My lawyers had already appeared before a judge in closed chambers. Given the evidence of massive fraud and the risk of flight or asset destruction, the judge had granted an emergency writ of possession and an asset freeze order. The order was dated for today. The effective time was midnight. I glanced at the cheap digital watch on my wrist. It was 8 o'clock in the evening, 4 hours. For 4 more hours, Arthur Sterling was the king of Virginia. For 4 more hours, Edward was the heir apparent. For 4 more hours, they could sneer at my clothes and mock my life. I watched a waiter refill Arthur's glass with vintage Bordeaux. The wine shone like blood under the crystal chandeliers. Arthur took a sip, savoring it completely unaware that the wine, the glass, the table, and the very air he was breathing belonged to the son he had discarded. The trap was not just set. The jaws were already closing. They just hadn't felt the bite yet. I took a deep breath, letting the scent of expensive perfume and hypocrisy fill my lungs. I felt calm. It was the calm of a demolition expert who has wired the building, checked the connections, cleared the perimeter, and is now standing with his thumb hovering over the detonator, just waiting for the countdown to reach 0. I wasn't here to start a fight. I was here to finish one. I was here to watch the controlled demolition of a 100-year-old lie. 4 hours, I whispered to the empty air. The ghost in the machine was about to materialize, and he was bringing hell with him. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted perceptibly as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. It was a subtle change at first, a dimming of the perimeter sconces that forced the collective gaze of the 200 guests inward toward the raised dais at the far end of the room. The string quartet, who had been playing a harmless rendition of Mozart, faded into silence with practiced obedience. A single, piercing beam of white light cut through the gloom, illuminating the podium. It was theatrical. It was excessive. It was perfectly Arthur Sterling. My father stepped into the spotlight as if he were stepping into a warm bath. He did not blink against the glare. He absorbed it. He stood tall, adjusting his silk tie with a slow, deliberate motion that commanded absolute silence. To the casual observer, he looked like the patriarch of a dynasty, a man carved from granite and old money. To me, he looked like a man standing on a trapdoor that he had forgotten he installed. He tapped the microphone twice. Thump, thump. The sound echoed through the cavernous room, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling and the diamond necklaces of the senators' wives. My friends, Arthur began, his voice a rich baritone that had charmed voters and investors for 4 decades. My family, my partners in building a better Virginia. He paused for effect, letting the words settle like fine dust. 40 years ago, I laid the first brick of the Sterling Group. I did not have much. I had a vision. I had a dream. And most importantly, I had values. Values that were handed down to me by my father and his father before him. I felt a wave of nausea roll through my stomach. The only thing his father had handed down to him was a propensity for tax evasion and a bottle of gin. But the crowd nodded reverently. They were eating it up. We live in a world that is changing fast, Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper that the microphone amplified into a roar. But some things must remain eternal. Integrity, loyalty, family. These are not just words to us. They are the mortar that holds our lives together. Without family, a man is nothing but a leaf in the wind. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. It tasted like copper. Here was a man who had disowned his son for being honest, who had stolen his wife's medical fund to buy a watch, preaching about family being the mortar of life. He was not talking about love. He was talking about compliance. To Arthur, family was a structure where he was the roof, and everyone else was a load-bearing wall designed to hold him up. As Arthur launched into a rehearsed anecdote about how he supposedly taught us the value of a hard-earned dollar, a complete fabrication involving a lemonade stand that never existed, I felt a presence at my elbow. The air grew colder. I smelled expensive cologne-stale scotch and aggression. "You are still here," a voice hissed. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage, watching our father perform. "It is a free country, Edward, or so I am told." Edward moved closer, invading my personal space until his shoulder pressed against my arm. It was a physical challenge, a childish shove disguised as proximity. "Do not play smart with me, Richard," Edward whispered, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I saw you talking to the valet. I saw you looking at the guests. You are making people uncomfortable. You look like a stain on a silk sheet." "I think the word you are looking for is contrast," I replied calmly. "Listen to me," Edward said, and I could hear the grinding of his teeth. "This night is important. It is crucial for my campaign. I have donors here who are on the fence. I cannot have my dropout brother hovering around like a specter of failure. After tonight, I want you gone. I want you out of Virginia. Go to Ohio. Go to hell, I do not care. But if I see your face in this state again, I will have you arrested for vagrancy. I will plant something on you if I have to. Do not test me." I finally turned to look at him. My brother, the future mayor, the future CEO. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide and manic, darting around the room to make sure no one was witnessing his breakdown. He was a man trying to hold back the tide with a plastic spoon. "You are threatening me with exile, Edward?" I asked, keeping my voice conversational. "That is bold for a man whose own house is burning down," Edward scoffed. "What are you talking about? My house is made of gold." "I am talking about the Seaport project," I said. The color drained from Edward's face so fast, it looked like a magic trick. 1 second, he was flushed with anger. The next, he was as pale as the napkins on the buffet table. The Seaport project was the jewel in his campaign crown. It was supposed to be a massive revitalization of the waterfront, a joint venture between the city and the Sterling Group. It was the platform he was running on. "How?" Edward stammered, his voice cracking. "How do you know that name? That is confidential." "I know that the environmental impact study failed 3 weeks ago," I said, reciting the facts I had memorized from the encrypted files on the drive in my pocket. "I know that the structural steel provider went bankrupt last Monday, and I know that you have been using campaign funds to pay off the zoning board to keep the project alive on paper until after the election." Edward took a step back, looking at me as if I had just pulled a live cobra out of my pocket. "You are lying. You are a construction worker. You dig ditches. You do not know anything about high-level development. I know that if that information leaks, you go to prison, Edward, not the mayor's office. Prison." For a moment, pure fear flashed in his eyes. But then the arrogance kicked back in. It was his default setting, his defense mechanism against reality. He straightened his tuxedo jacket and forced a sneer. "You are bluffing," he spat. "You heard some rumors at a bar and you think you can scare me? Do not worry about grown-up business bricklayer. You just worry about making rent. Go back to your trailer park and leave the thinking to the men in suits." He turned his back on me, dismissing me, refusing to engage with the truth, because the truth was inconvenient. He walked away to refill his drink, his hands shaking slightly. I watched him go. He was a dead man walking. He just didn't know he had already been executed. I felt a tug on my sleeve, a gentle, desperate pull. I looked down. My mother Evelyn had slid her chair back from the table. She was not looking at me. She was looking at her lap, where her hands were fumbling with a thick, white envelope. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Arthur's booming voice on the speakers. She tried to shove the envelope into my hand. It was heavy. It felt like stacks of $100 bills. "Take this," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes, threatening to ruin her mascara. "There is $5,000 in there. Please, Richard, just take it and go. Leave through the back. Before he sees you again. Before he gets angry." I looked at the envelope. It was the same solution she had applied to every problem for 40 years. Throw money at it. Hide it. Make it go away. She wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to buy her own peace of mind. She wanted me gone so she didn't have to look at her failure, so she didn't have to feel the guilt of abandoning me. "Mom," I said softly. "Please," she begged. "He is in a mood tonight. If you stay, he will hurt you. He will say things. I cannot watch it again. Take the money, buy some new clothes, buy a warm meal, just go." I reached out and gently pushed her hand back. I closed her fingers around the envelope. Her skin was cold and papery. "Keep it, Mom," I said. "What?" "No, you need it. You are—" She couldn't even say the word poor. It was too vulgar for her. "I do not want his money," I said. "And I do not want yours. "You should keep this, Evelyn. Put it somewhere safe. Put it somewhere he cannot find it." "Why?" she asked, confused. "Because very soon," I said, looking her in the eye, "you are going to need this $5,000 a lot more than I do." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, unable to comprehend what I was saying. To her, the idea that the sterling fortune could evaporate was as impossible as the sun failing to rise. She pulled her hand back, clutching the envelope to her chest like a talisman. At that moment, the music swelled. A fanfare of trumpets played over the speakers, cutting off my mother's confusion. Arthur Sterling raised both hands to the ceiling, basking in the adoration of his sycophants. "But tonight," Arthur shouted, his voice reaching a crescendo, "is not about the past. It is about the future. It is about continuity. It is about the next generation of leadership." The crowd hushed. This was it. The moment Edward had been waiting for his entire life. The coronation. Arthur swept his arm toward the side of the stage where Edward was standing, trying to look regal, despite the fear I had just planted in his gut. "I am proud to announce," Arthur bellowed, "that effective tomorrow morning I will be stepping down as CEO of the Sterling Group, and taking my place leading us into the next century is my son, my pride, the future mayor of our great city, Edward Sterling." The room exploded. It was a wall of sound. 200 people clapping, cheering, and whistling. Champagne corks popped. Streamers fired from hidden cannons in the ceiling, raining down silver and gold confetti. Edward walked onto the stage, waving his smile plastered on, soaking in the applause that he believed he deserved. He hugged Arthur. They stood there, father and son, the architect of the fraud and the heir to the ruin. They looked like gods. I stood by the pillar motionless. I watched them celebrate a victory that was already a defeat. Then I started to clap. I did not clap like the others. I did not clap fast. I brought my hands together with slow, heavy force. Clap, pause, clap, pause, clap. The sound was distinct. It was rhythmic. It was jarring. It cut through the frantic, chaotic cheering of the crowd like a heartbeat. It was the sound of a judge's gavel hitting the bench. It was the sound of a clock ticking down the final seconds. Clap, clap, clap. People near me stopped cheering. They turned to look. They saw the man in the work boots and the dusty clothes clapping with a solemn, terrifying intensity. They looked uncomfortable. The circle of silence around me grew, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Arthur heard it. On the stage, amidst the adulation, his eyes snapped open. He looked out into the crowd, seeking the source of the dissonance. He found me. The spotlight was on him, but his eyes were on me. The smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. He saw me standing there, refusing to bow, refusing to disappear. He saw the slow, mocking applause. I saw the irritation flare in his eyes. It was the annoyance of a man who sees a fly on his wedding cake. He was not afraid yet. He was just offended. How dare I? How dare the failure interrupt the coronation? He leaned into the microphone, his eyes locking onto mine with a cruelty that was sharp enough to draw blood. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was not going to have security drag me out. That would be messy. That would look weak. No. He was going to use me. He was going to turn my presence into a prop. He was going to crush me publicly one last time to show the world just how superior Edward was. He signaled for the applause to die down. He held up a hand, silence falling over the room once more. "Thank you," Arthur said, his voice dripping with false humility. "Thank you all. But looking out at this crowd, seeing the excellence gathered here, I am reminded that not every investment yields a return." He pointed a finger, a long, accusatory finger. It pointed straight through the darkness, straight through the crowd, and landed directly on my chest. The spotlight operator followed the gesture. A beam of blinding light swung across the room and hit me. I did not flinch. I did not shield my eyes. I stood in the harsh glare, the center of attention, the designated villain in his play. "We have to acknowledge the reality, Arthur," said his voice, taking on a sorrowful, pitying tone that was far more damaging than anger. "That sometimes, despite the best soil and the best care, a branch just grows crooked." The trap was sprung. But he didn't realize that by pulling me into the light, he hadn't exposed a victim. He had invited the executioner onto the stage. The silence in the room was absolute. It was not the peaceful silence of a library or a church. It was the suffocating heavy silence of a vacuum just before the seal breaks. 200 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, pinned by the beam of the spotlight that felt physically hot against my skin. I could see the dust motes dancing and the cone of light swirling chaotically, indifferent to the tension that was tightening around the throat of every person in the room. Arthur stood on the stage, gripping the microphone stand with both hands. His knuckles were white. He looked like a preacher about to deliver a sermon on hellfire, but his church was capitalism, and his scripture was his own ego. He took a deep breath, his chest expanding beneath his starched shirt, preparing to deliver the blow he had been rehearsing in his mind for years. "To get to where we are today," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards, "I have had to sacrifice more than any man should. I have given my time. I have given my sleep. I have given my blood." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the front row, where the most important donors sat. He wanted them to see his burden. He wanted them to see the martyr behind the billionaire. But he continued, a softness entering his tone that I knew was as artificial as the sweetener in his coffee. "When I look at my children, I see that the sacrifice was worth it." He turned his body slightly to the right, gesturing toward Edward with an open palm, like a magician revealing a tiger. "Edward, Arthur," said his voice swelling with theatrical pride, "you are my strength. You are the steel in the spine of this family. You are the future mayor, and you are the pride of my life." Edward beamed. He puffed out his chest, looking like a rooster who had just been told he owned the sunrise. He nodded to the crowd, acknowledging their applause, with the grace of a man who believes he was born to be worshipped. Arthur then turned to the other side of the stage, where Sarah stood near the edge, shimmering in her silver gown. "And Sarah," Arthur cooed, "my beautiful Sarah, you are the jewel of the sterling crown. You bring elegance and light to everything you touch." Sarah brought a hand to her chest, feigning a gasp of delight, blowing a kiss to her father. The crowd murmured their approval. It was a perfect tableau. The king, the prince, and the princess. A dynasty of success. And then the air shifted. Arthur stopped moving. He stopped smiling. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his entire body until he was facing the back of the room. He was facing the darkness. He was facing me. The spotlight operator, sensing the cue, narrowed the beam. The light around me intensified, cutting out the rest of the room, leaving me alone in a cylinder of blinding white. I could not see the crowd anymore. I could only see Arthur standing on his illuminated perch, looking down at me like a god judging a sinner. "And then," Arthur said, his voice changing, the warmth evaporated. The pride vanished. In its place was a cold, jagged edge. "There is Richard." He said my name like it was a disease. He said it like it was a curse word he was forced to utter in polite company. "Richard," he repeated, shaking his head with a performance of deep, sorrowful regret. "Your presence here tonight reminds me of a hard lesson that every farmer knows. It reminds me that not every seed you plant in the ground grows toward the sun. Some seeds are just rotten from the core." A gasp rippled through the room. The guests had expected a rebuke, perhaps a snide comment about my clothes. They had not expected this. This was a public flaying. This was a father taking a knife to his son in front of the entire town. Arthur let the gasp fade. He wanted them uncomfortable. He wanted them to feel his pain, to side with him against the disappointment. I have tried, Arthur said, looking up at the ceiling as if pleading with the heavens. God knows I have tried. I gave you opportunities. I gave you education. I gave you a name that opens doors on every continent. And what did you do with it? He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing. You threw it away. You chose the dirt. You chose to turn your back on your heritage. He leaned closer to the microphone, his lips almost touching the metal mesh. The speakers popped with the intensity of his breath. But I am still a father, he declared, his voice booming, reclaiming the moral high ground. I am a forgiving man. I am a generous man. And despite the heartache, despite the embarrassment, he paused. This was the crescendo. This was the moment he would cement his legacy and destroy mine. I am proud of all my children, Arthur shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent ballroom. Except the loser. The words hung in the air. They were physical things, heavy and ugly. Except the loser. For a second there was total silence. Then, from the corner where Edward's campaign staff stood, a sound emerged. A giggle. Then a chuckle. Then, like a contagion, it spread. The sycophants, the climbers, the people who needed Arthur's money and Edward's favor, they began to laugh. It was a cruel, tittering sound. It was the sound of the playground bully's entourage. They were laughing because they were relieved it wasn't them. They were laughing because power was mocking weakness, and they wanted to be on the side of power. Edward was grinning openly now, a nasty, triumphant smirk that twisted his handsome face into something grotesque. He raised his glass to me in a mock salute, mouthing the word loser. Arthur wasn't finished. The laughter fed him. He saw that I was still standing, that I hadn't crumbled into dust, and it urged him on. He wanted blood. Look at him, Arthur sneered, abandoning the pretense of sorrow for pure, unadulterated venom. A 40-year-old man. No home, no wife, no career, no legacy. Just a man in dirty clothes crashing a party he cannot afford. He pointed at me again, his finger trembling with the force of his disdain. You are a stain on the sterling name Richard. You are a footnote in a book about success. You are nothing. The crowd quieted down, waiting. They were waiting for the kill. They were waiting for me to break. They expected me to cry. They expected me to scream. They expected me to turn around and run out the door, humiliated, crushed, under the weight of my father's judgment. I stood there in the spotlight. My heart was beating, but not with fear. It was beating with a slow, steady rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. I looked at Arthur. I saw the sweat on his forehead. I saw the desperate need in his eyes, the need to be right, the need to be superior, the need to win. He was so small. Standing on that stage, surrounded by his millions, he was the smallest man I had ever seen. He thought he had just destroyed me. He thought he had just stripped me naked before the world. But he was wrong. He had just set me free. By publicly disowning me, by calling me a loser, by rejecting me with such absolute finality, he had severed the last invisible thread that bound me to him. He had absolved me of any lingering guilt. I owed him nothing now. He owed not respect, not mercy, not even the silence of a dutiful son. I felt a bubble of emotion rise in my chest. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness. It was joy. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my head. I let the spotlight hit my face full on. I did not blink. I looked straight across the room, locking eyes with Arthur. And I smiled. It was not a bitter smile. It was not a sarcastic smirk. It was a genuine, radiant smile. It was the smile of a man who has just been told a joke that only he understands. It was a smile of pure relief. It was the smile of a man who knows that the person screaming at him is standing in a house that does not belong to him anymore. Arthur froze. The smile confused him. He expected tears. He expected rage. He did not know what to do with happiness. His brow furrowed. The microphone dipped slightly in his hand. I reached out to a nearby waiter's tray, my movements languid and relaxed, as if I were moving underwater. The waiter flinched, but I ignored him. But I picked up a simple glass of ice water. I held the glass up. The light caught the water, making it sparkle more brightly than the champagne in Edward's hand. I raised the glass higher, directing it straight at Arthur. It was a toast, a silent, terrifying toast. To you, Arthur, my eyes said. To the loser, to the end. I kept my smile fixed on him, brought the glass to my lips, and drank. I drank the whole glass, my throat working as I swallowed, never breaking eye contact. The room was dead silent again. The laughter had died in their throats. They didn't understand what was happening. Why was the loser smiling? Why wasn't he running? Why did he look like he had just won the lottery? Arthur's face turned a deep, violent shade of red. He gripped the podium so hard, I thought the wood might splinter. He opened his mouth to shout something else, to demand that I be thrown, out to regain control of the narrative that was slipping through his fingers like sand, but he couldn't speak. My smile had jammed the gears of his cruelty. He was baffled. He was furious. He was afraid. I lowered the empty glass and placed it gently on a passing tray. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, still smiling that serene, dangerous smile. Arthur had wanted a show. He had wanted a tragedy. I had just turned it into a thriller, and he was just beginning to realize that he wasn't the hero of this story. He was the victim. The silence that followed my toast was not empty. It was heavy, pregnant with a tension that felt like the air pressure drop before a tornado touches down. Arthur stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the microphone forgotten in his hand. He was waiting for the punchline, for the moment I would crumble, but I just stood there, the empty water glass resting on the tray next to me, my hands casually clasped behind my back. Then the first crack in the dam appeared. It started with a sound that was almost imperceptible against the vast silence of the ballroom. It was a low, persistent buzzing. It was coming from the pocket of Edward's tuxedo jacket. Zzzt! 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 Edward looked down, annoyed. He fished his phone out, glancing at the screen with a scowl. I knew who was calling. It was the chief financial officer of the Sterling Group, a man named Patterson. Patterson was a nervous creature, the kind of man who sweated when the air conditioning was on full blast. Right now, he was likely hyperventilating in his office downtown, watching digital padlocks snap shut over every account he managed. Edward thumbed the decline button with a dismissive sneer and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing silently, promising retribution for my insolence. But the phone rang again immediately. Zeest, zeest. At the same time, a ripple began to move through the room. It started near the back, where the investment bankers and hedge fund managers were clustered near the bar. These were men who lived their lives attached to the pulse of the market. I saw one of them, a senior partner at Goldman Sachs, pull his phone out. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He tapped the shoulder of the man next to him and whispered something urgent. The whisper spread like a virus. It moved from the bankers to the politicians, from the politicians to the socialites. I saw heads bending together. I saw screens lighting up faces with a ghostly blue glow. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to a sharp electric anxiety. It was the smell of blood in the water. A murmur broke out. It wasn't the polite chatter of a cocktail party. It was the low, panicked hum of a crowd, realizing the exits might be locked. Someone near the front whispered the words, "Asset freeze." Someone else whispered, "Indictment." Arthur sensed the shift. He was a master of the room, and he knew he was losing it. He didn't know why, but he knew the attention was drifting away from his glorification and toward something dangerous. He needed to regain control. He needed to excise the tumor that was ruining his night. He pointed at me again, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage. "Security!" Arthur roared into the microphone. The feedback squealed a high-pitched shriek that made everyone wince. "Get him out of here! Now!" The crowd parted instinctively. From the shadows near the main entrance, the head of the security detail stepped forward. His name was Marcus. He was a giant of a man, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and stone, a former linebacker who had been running security for the Sterling estate for 5 years. He wore an earpiece and a suit that struggled to contain his shoulders. Arthur looked at Marcus and jerked his head toward me. "Throw this trash out on the street where he belongs. And if he resists, do not be afraid to roughen him up. I will cover the legal fees." Edward laughed a short barking sound. "Yeah, teach him a lesson, Marcus. Drag him out by his hair." Marcus began to walk across the floor. His footsteps were heavy, thudding against the parquet. The guests shrank back, terrified of the violence that seemed imminent. I did not move. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, watching the giant approach. Arthur smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. He was expecting the satisfying image of his failure, son being manhandled and tossed into the dirt. He was already composing the joke he would tell to smooth things over once I was gone. Marcus stopped 3 feet in front of me. He towered over me, casting a shadow that swallowed me whole. The room held its breath. Then Marcus did something that made Arthur's jaw drop. He did not grab me. He did not pull his baton. Instead, he straightened his posture, brought his heels together, and bowed his head slightly. It was a gesture of respect, a gesture of deference. "Good evening, Mr. Johnson," Marcus said, his voice deep and rumbling, audible enough for the first few rows to hear. "The perimeter is secure. Your team is in position outside." Arthur looked like he had been slapped with a wet fish. He blinked once, twice, trying to process the visual data that his brain was rejecting. "Marcus," Arthur sputtered, "what are you doing? I gave you a direct order. Grab him." Marcus did not turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on me, awaiting my command. "Are you deaf?" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking. "I pay your salary, you incompetent idiot. I own you. Do your job." I took a step forward, moving past Marcus, patting the big man on the arm as I went. I walked toward the center of the room, toward the AV console that controlled the massive projection screen behind the stage. "You are mistaken, Arthur," I said. I did not use a microphone. I did not need one. My voice was projected from the diaphragm, honed by years of shouting over jackhammers and diesel engines. It carried a weight that Arthur's amplified voice lacked. "You do not pay his salary." Arthur gripped the podium, his knuckles turning white. "Excuse me? I have signed his checks for 5 years." "You signed checks," I corrected, walking steadily toward the tech booth, where a terrified audio engineer was cowering. "But those checks have been bouncing for 3 months. Marcus and his team haven't seen a dime of your money since October." A gasp went through the crowd. In their world, not paying the help was a sin, but bouncing checks was a death sentence. It meant insolvency. "Liar!" Edward shouted, stepping to the edge of the stage. "We have millions in the bank. You are just making things up." I reached the console. The engineer looked at me, then at Arthur, then back at me. He saw the way Marcus was standing guard. He made the smart choice. He stepped away from the laptop, surrendering the controls. "Actually," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the USB drive, "I have been paying them. For the last 90 days, the security of this estate, the safety of your guests, and the protection of your person has been funded by RJ Holdings." I held the drive up for a moment, letting the light catch the brushed metal. "You see, Arthur, you were right about one thing earlier," I continued, my voice calm, conversational, deadly. "I am a failure." I inserted the drive into the USB port. The laptop chimed. "I failed to become a liar like you," I said. "I failed to become a thief like you. And I certainly failed to become a man who would sell his own family for a seat at the table." My fingers flew across the keyboard. I didn't need to look. I knew exactly which file to open. I hit the enter key. "No!" Arthur screamed, realizing too late what was happening. "Cut the power! Someone cut the power!" But it was too late. The massive screen behind the stage, which had been displaying the golden, interlaced S logo of the Sterling Group, flickered. The image, distorted, pixelated, and then vanished. For a heartbeat, the screen was black. Then a document appeared. It was projected in high definition, 20 feet tall, looming over Arthur and Edward like a judge's verdict. It was a bank transfer record. But not just any record. It was a screenshot of the internal ledger of Vantage Capital. "What is that?" someone in the crowd whispered. "That," I said, pointing to the screen, "is the truth you have been hiding in the Seychelles." The document clearly showed a transfer of $45 million, but the devastating part was the header. Notice of assignment of debt and collateral assignor, Vantage Capital, global assignee, RJ Holdings, collateral listed, 1045 Oak Ridge Manor, the Sterling Estate, Sterling Tower, all future revenue streams. "You mortgaged it all," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You leveraged every brick of this house, every acre of this land, to cover your losses in the futures market. And when Vantage Capital went under, they sold your debt. To me." I hit the next arrow key. The screen changed. Now it showed a grid of shell companies. Blue, Heron Consulting. Apex Strategic Partners. First Dominion Trust. Arrows connected these companies to Arthur's personal offshore accounts. And underneath each company name was the signature of the registered agent. "Look familiar, Edward?" I asked. Edward was staring at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. He recognized the names. He had helped create them. "Those are the companies you used to siphon off the construction loans," I explained to the room, acting as the narrator of their destruction. "You took loans to build hospitals, and schools funneled the money into these fake entities, and then declared the projects stalled due to market conditions. You stole from the city. You stole from the banks. And you stole from the people in this room." The atmosphere in the room transformed instantly. The guests were no longer confused. They were furious. These were the donors. These were the investors. They were looking at the screen and realizing that the money they had given Arthur for his vision was sitting in a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. "This is a fabrication," Arthur shrieked. He looked small now, dwarfed by the glowing evidence behind him. "He forged it. It is a deep fake. Technology can do anything these days." "Is it?" I asked. I hit the key again. The screen changed to a PDF document. It was a court order. It bore the official seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia, stamped and signed by the Chief Justice only 4 hours ago. Right of possession and immediate asset. Freeze. Plaintiff, Richard Johnson. Defendant, Arthur Sterling, Edward Sterling Group. The text was dense, but the bold conclusion at the bottom was legible, even from the back of the room. Effective immediately. Title of property transfer to plaintiff. Defendants to vacate premises upon notice. "You are trespassing, Arthur," I said. The sound of shattering glass punctuated the sentence. Edward's hand had gone numb. His champagne flute hit the hardwood floor, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. The expensive wine pooled around his Italian shoes, looking like blood in the stage lights. Arthur swayed. For the first time in his life, the foundation wasn't just shaking. It was gone. His face usually flushed with the ruddy complexion of the well-fed, drained of all color. He looked like a wax figure left too close to a fire. He grabbed the podium, not for authority, but to keep from collapsing. I walked away from the console and stood in the center of the room between the guests and the stage. I was the bridge between the lies they had been told and the reality they were now seeing. "The wind has changed, Father," I said softly, though in the silence it sounded like a shout. "You built a castle on sand and the tide just came in." The VIPs were no longer whispering, they were moving. The bankers were already on their phones barking sell orders, trying to dump Sterling stock before the market opened the next morning. The politicians were signaling their aides desperate to leave to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Sterling name. The party wasn't just over. It was a crime scene, and I was the one holding the flashlight. I stepped onto the platform, not with the hesitant shuffle of the construction worker they thought I was, but with the purposeful stride of a man who owns the building. The wooden floorboards of the stage, which had vibrated under my father's booming lies just moments ago, now felt solid beneath my boots. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. It was still warm from Arthur's grip. I held it loosely, comfortable, my other hand resting in my pocket where the remote control for the presentation software waited. The transformation was instant. The slouch I had adopted for 20 years, the protective posture of the beaten dog, evaporated. My shoulders squared, my chin lifted. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces at the senators and the bank presidents and the social climbers, and I did not see a crowd. I saw a jury. "If you will all look at the screen," I said, my voice crisp, devoid of the southern drawl I used on job sites. I sounded like the algorithm I had built, cold, precise, and irrefutable. "Let us begin with a case study in philanthropy." I clicked the remote. The image on the massive screen behind me shifted instantly. It was a complex flowchart, but I had designed it to be understood by a child, or a jury. "This," I said, gesturing to a bright red line zigzagging across the screen, "is the trajectory of the donations collected during last year's Hope for Tomorrow gala. This is the event where my brother Edward famously wept on stage while talking about underprivileged children." Edward was standing at the base of the stairs, his face the color of ash. He opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. "You raised $1.2 million that night." I continued pacing the stage, like I was delivering a keynote at a tech conference. "A magnificent sum. The donors were told that 100% of the proceeds would go to building a new pediatric wing at the city hospital." I clicked again. The screen zoomed in on a bank transfer dated October 15th. "However," I said, letting the word hang there. "On October 17th, 3 days after the checks cleared, a wire transfer of $250,000 was initiated from the charity's holding account. It did not go to a hospital. It did not go to a contractor." I pointed to the destination field on the projected document. It was highlighted in yellow. "It went to the Bellagio Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas," I stated clearly, as specifically to settle a marker under the name of Edward Sterling. A collective gasp went through the room, sharper and louder than before. This was not just bad business. This was theft. This was stealing from sick children. "That is a lie!" Edward screamed, finding his voice. He looked wild, his hair disheveled. "That was a consulting fee, a legitimate expense." "For a casino?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I did not realize the pediatric wing required expertise on roulette strategies. But if you want to argue legitimacy, let us look at the next transaction, November 3rd. Another $100,000, sent to a shell company called Ace Ventures, which coincidentally is registered to your personal trainer. The reporters who had been lingering near the buffet table, drinking free champagne, were no longer drinking. They were swarming. I saw the red lights of recording devices. I saw smartphones held high, live streaming the collapse of a dynasty to the world. This was no longer a society page, fluff piece. This was the lead story on the 11 o'clock news. I turned away from Edward, dismissing him as a petty criminal, and focused my attention on the main target, Arthur. "But Edward is just an amateur," I said, walking to the other side of the stage. "He steals because he is greedy. Arthur, you steal because you are evil." Arthur was shaking. He looked like he was having a seizure while standing up. His eyes were bulging. I clicked the remote. The screen turned a dark, ominous gray. A topographical map appeared. "The Riverside Lofts," I announced. Arthur's crowning achievement. A luxury apartment complex built on the old industrial waterfront. Sold out before the foundation was even poured. Families are moving in next month. I paused, looking directly into the camera lens of a reporter standing in the front row. What the brochure did not tell you, I said, keeping my voice steady, is why the land was so cheap. It was cheap because it was a toxic waste dump in the 1970s. I clicked again. A chemical analysis report appeared. The numbers were off the charts. This is a soil sample taken from the site 6 months ago, I explained. The lead levels are 400 times the legal safety limit for residential zoning. 400 times. It is not just dirt, Arthur. It is poison. The room was deadly silent. The horror of it was sinking in. This wasn't money. This was lives. You knew, I said, turning to look at my father. The environmental engineer sent you this report. I have the email. I have your reply. I put the email on the screen. It was short. It was brutal. Subject, soil toxicity. From Arthur Sterling. Message, bury the report, bury the dirt. If you delay construction, you are fired. I will handle the zoning commission. And you did handle them, I said. You paid the zoning commissioner $50,000 in cash. To look the other way, I have the withdrawal slip. I have the witness testimony from the bagman who delivered it. The reporters were typing furiously on their phones. The flashbulbs were blinding now, a strobe light effect that made the scene look like a horror movie. Arthur snapped. The veneer of the statesman cracked and fell away, revealing the cornered animal underneath. He roared, a guttural, inarticulate sound of pure rage, and lunged for the stairs. "Shut up!" Arthur screamed, his face purple. "Shut your mouth, you ungrateful dog!" He charged up the steps, his hands reaching for the microphone, reaching for my throat. He wanted to strangle the truth before I could say another word. But he never reached me. The head of security, the man Arthur had screamed at, only minutes ago stepped into his path. He did not use excessive force. He simply planted his feet and put up one massive hand. Arthur slammed into the wall of muscle and bounced back, stumbling and nearly falling off the stage. "Step back, Mr. Sterling," the security chief said, his voice flat and professional. "Do not touch him." Arthur stared at the guard, betrayed, breathless. "I am the owner of this house. Get out of my way." "No, sir," the guard said. "You are not. Not anymore." Arthur spun around to face the crowd, to face the cameras. He pointed a shaking finger at the screen, at the documents damning him to prison. "It is a lie!" Arthur shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "It is all fake. He forged them. He is a computer genius. He can make anything look real. None of this is admissible. It is a hoax." I watched him flail, calm in the center of the storm. "Forgery?" I asked, my voice amplified clearly over his screaming. "That is a serious accusation, Arthur. But luckily we do not have to rely on my word." I scanned the room until I found the man I was looking for. He was standing near the exit, trying to make himself invisible behind a potted palm. "Mr. Marcus," I called out. Arthur's personal attorney, the man who drafted the non-disclosure agreements, the man who set up the shell companies. Every head in the room turned to look at the lawyer. Mr. Marcus was a small man with thinning hair and expensive glasses. He froze, caught in the headlights of public scrutiny. "Mr. Marcus," I said, my voice polite but firm, "Arthur claims these documents are forgeries. Would you like to come up here and verify your signature on the articles of incorporation for the fake charity?" Arthur turned to his lawyer, his eyes wide with desperation. "Tell them, Marcus. Tell them this is insanity. Sue him for defamation." Mr. Marcus did not step forward. He did not look at Arthur. He looked at his shoes. He adjusted his glasses nervously. He had been in a room with me and a federal prosecutor 3 days ago. He knew exactly what the deal was. He could trade his license for his freedom, or he could go down with the ship. He had chosen to swim. Mr. Marcus stammered, his voice barely audible. "I cannot comment on ongoing litigation. But the documents appear to be authentic." Arthur looked as if he had been shot in the gut. He staggered back, clutching his chest. The betrayal was absolute. His own lawyer had just hammered the final nail into the coffin. Authentic, I repeated, letting the word echo. I walked to the edge of the stage and sat down on the edge, my legs dangling, bringing me closer to the audience. I was no longer the prosecutor. I was the son. I looked down at the front row, at the woman sitting there, her face buried in her hands. "And you, mother," I said softly. Evelyn looked up. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black streaks. She looked old. She looked broken. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. "You knew about the lead paint. You knew about the stolen charity money. You knew about the blackmail." "No," she sobbed, shaking her head. "I didn't. I just wanted peace, Richard. I just wanted everyone to be happy." "No, Mom," I said, shaking my head. "You wanted to be comfortable. There is a difference." I pointed to the handbag resting at her feet. It was a Birkin bag made of crocodile skin. It cost more than a year of college tuition. You knew that every time Arthur came home with a new deal, it meant someone else was getting hurt, I said. "But you didn't ask questions, because if you asked questions, the gifts might stop. The trips to Paris might stop. You traded your conscience for a closet full of leather and silk." "I was afraid," she cried out, her voice shrill. "He is a powerful man. What could I do?" "You could have protected your children," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "When he locked me in that study for 12 hours, you knew. You heard me knocking. But you turned up the television. You sat in the living room and watched a game show because the noise of your son begging for water was inconvenient." Evelyn broke down completely. She wailed a sound of pure, unadulterated grief and shame. It was the sound of a woman realizing that her entire life had been a gilded cage that she had locked from the inside. Her silence hadn't been survival. It had been collaboration. And now, the bill was due. The room was uncomfortable. This was too raw. This was the autopsy of a family performed live. I stood up. I brushed the dust off my trousers, the dust from the honest work that they had despised. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 11:55. "I did not come here tonight to ruin a party," I said, addressing the room for the final time. "I came here to serve an eviction notice." I gestured to the screen one last time. The writ of possession was still glowing there. "At 12 o'clock midnight," I said. "Ownership of the Sterling estate transfers to R.J. Holdings. That is in 5 minutes." I looked at Arthur, who was slumped against the podium, a broken king in a ruined kingdom. I looked at Edward, who was weeping silently into his hands. I looked at Sarah, who was frantically texting, trying to save her social standing. "The party is over," I said. "You do not have to go home because this is not your home anymore. But you do have to get out of mine." I dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a thud that sounded like a door slamming shut on 100 years of history. The thud of the microphone hitting the stage floor echoed like a gunshot, signaling the end of the performance, but for Edward, it was the starting pistol for madness. The reality of his situation had finally pierced the thick armor of his entitlement. He wasn't just losing an election. He was losing his life. The vision of the mayor's office, the Senate seat, the power. It was all dissolving into mist, replaced by the cold, hard bars of a federal penitentiary. Edward snapped. It wasn't a calculated move. It was the feral reaction of a trapped animal. He let out a strangled cry, a sound that was half sob and half scream, and he launched himself off the stage. He didn't take the stairs. He vaulted over the edge, landing clumsily on the parquet floor, stumbling, but regaining his balance with a manic energy. "You ruined everything!" Edward shrieked, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. "I will kill you! I will kill you!" he charged at me. The crowd gasped and scattered, creating a wide circle around us. They were terrified. To them, this was a brawl between brothers. To me, it was simply physics. Edward swung his right fist. It was a wide, telegraphed haymaker, the kind of punch a man throws when he has watched too many movies, but has never actually been in a fight. It was full of rage, but completely devoid of technique. I didn't step back. I didn't flinch. I had spent 10 years on construction sites. I had broken up fights between bricklayers over stolen tools. I had dodged swinging steel beams and navigated chaotic work zones, where a split-second reaction meant the difference between life and death. My body wasn't built in a gym like Edward's. It was forged in the fire of manual labor. My muscles were dense, reactive, and tired of being pushed around. As Edward's fist came flying toward my face, time seemed to slow down. I saw the sweat flying from his brow. I saw the desperate dilated pupils of his eyes. I stepped inside his guard, moving my head slightly to the left. His fist sailed harmlessly over my shoulder, cutting the air where my jaw had been a fraction of a second ago. I didn't punch him. I didn't need to. I simply used his own momentum against him. As he stumbled forward off balance from the missed strike, I hooked my leg behind his ankle and drove my shoulder into his chest. It was a simple takedown. Minimal effort. Maximum efficiency. Edward's feet flew out from under him. He hit the floor with a bone-rattling slam that knocked the wind out of his lungs. Before he could even think about scrambling up, I twisted his arm behind his back and pinned him to the polished wood, pressing my knee firmly into his spine. "Stay down, Edward," I said, my voice calm, barely elevated above a conversational volume. "You are not cut out for this. Stick to bribing zoning commissioners. It is safer." Edward thrashed beneath me, spitting curses, his expensive tuxedo crumpling against the floor, but he was powerless. He was a soft man in a hard world, and he had just collided with the reality he had spent his life avoiding. "Get off me," he wheezed. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," I replied, looking down at the back of his head. "You are defendant number 2. As if on cue, the double doors at the main entrance burst open. They didn't just open, they were thrown wide with a force that rattled the hinges. Blue and red lights from the driveway cut through the ambient lighting of the ballroom, strobing across the faces of the terrified guests. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" A dozen men and women in windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI and IRS poured into the room. They moved with the precision of a SWAT team. They didn't look at the guests. They didn't look at the buffet. They had their eyes locked on 2 targets. I stood up, releasing Edward. He didn't try to attack me again. He saw the badges. He saw the guns on their hips. He curled into a ball on the floor, weeping openly, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived. The lead agent, a stern woman with a sharp bob cut, walked straight toward the stage. She held a folded paper in her hand. But before she could reach the dais, Arthur Sterling made his move. My father, who had been watching the scene with the frozen horror of a man witnessing his own funeral, suddenly shook himself awake. His survival instinct, honed by 40 years of Shark Tank business deals, kicked into overdrive. He saw the police. He saw the end. And he did the only thing he knew how to do. He tried to make a deal. He scrambled down the stairs, nearly tripping in his haste. He ignored Edward, sobbing on the floor. He ignored the FBI agents closing in. He walked straight toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture, a desperate, tremulous smile plastered onto his face. "Richard," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "Richard's son, wait. Stop them." He reached out to grab my arm, but I took a step back. I didn't want him to touch me. "Richard, listen to me," he pleaded, his eyes darting between me and the approaching agents. "This has gone too far. We are family. We can work this out. We do not need the law involved. It is a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I asked, looking at him with genuine curiosity. "You think a $45 million fraud is a misunderstanding?" "Money," Arthur blurted out. "It is just money. I can fix it. Listen, Richard, I was wrong. I admit it. I underestimated you. You are smart. You are ruthless. You are a true Sterling. I see that now." He was panting, sweating profusely. The great Arthur Sterling was begging. "We can be partners," he insisted, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I will cut you in. 50%. No, wait, 60%. I will give you 60% of the company. You can run it. Edward is out. He is weak. But you and me, Richard, we can rule the state. 60%. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had terrified me as a child, the man whose approval I had craved for so long. And I felt nothing, no anger, no hate, just the cold indifference one feels for a stranger. 70%, Arthur cried, seeing that I wasn't responding. 70%, Richard. That is hundreds of millions of dollars. Just tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized the transfers. You can do that. You own the debt now. I laughed. It was a short, dry sound. You still do not get it, do you? I asked, shaking my head. Arthur, you are trying to give me 70% of a corpse. The Sterling Group is bankrupt. The stock is worthless. Your assets are frozen. You are offering me a slice of a pie that has already been eaten. I have offshore accounts, Arthur hissed, desperation, making him reckless. I have money hidden that they do not know about, gold, bonds. I will give it all to you. I do not want your money, Arthur, I said, my voice hardening. I have my own money, clean money. Money I made with my own brain and my own hands. I have more zeros in my bank account than you have ever seen in your life. Arthur froze. The realization hit him. He couldn't buy me. He had no currency that I valued. He changed tactics instantly. The businessman vanished, replaced by the manipulator. His face crumpled. Tears, fake theatrical tears, welled up in his eyes. Don't do this, he sobbed, reaching for my hand again. Please, I am your father. I raised you. I fed you. I gave you life. Family is everything, Richard. You said it yourself once. Do not destroy your own blood. I leaned in close. I invaded his personal space, just as he had invaded mine so many times when I was a helpless child. I brought my face inches from his so close. I could smell the fear radiating off him like sour milk. You never raised me, Arthur, I whispered, my voice a blade of ice. You only raised your ego. You fed it on my pain. You built your self-worth on the foundation of making me feel small. You didn't want a son. You wanted a mirror that would only reflect what you wanted to see. Arthur flinched, as if I had struck him. And let this be the final business lesson from the loser. I continued, emphasizing the word he had used to brand me. Never, ever underestimate a competitor just because he is wearing work boots. You looked at the surface and saw a failure. I looked at the data and saw a fraud. Checkmate. I pulled back and nodded to the lead agent. He is all yours, I said. The agents moved in. Arthur Sterling, the lead agent, announced, her voice cutting through the room. You are under arrest for securities, fraud wire, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. Arthur tried to pull away, but two agents grabbed his arms. They spun him around. Click. The sound of the handcuffs ratchet locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was louder than the applause, louder than the music. It was the sound of justice. Edward Sterling, another agent, shouted, hauling my brother up from the floor. You are under arrest for embezzlement, misuse of charitable funds, and bribery. Edward was wailing like a child, his legs dragging as they pulled him toward the door. Daddy, do something, Daddy! But Daddy couldn't do anything. Arthur was being marched toward the exit. The press, sensing the money shot, surged forward. The police didn't stop them. The flashbulbs erupted. Flash, flash, flash. It was a lightning storm of white light. Arthur Sterling, the man who had spent a fortune curating his image, The man who refused to be seen without a tailored suit was now immortalized in silver bracelets, his hair messy, his face a mask of defeat. He tried to hide his face, ducking his head, but the cameras were relentless. They captured every wrinkle of fear, every shadow of shame. I watched them go. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just watched, drinking in the sight of the monster being defanged. It was a sweet, cold nectar. It wasn't violent revenge. I hadn't raised a hand against him. I had simply turned on the lights, and the roaches had scattered. As the commotion of the arrest moved toward the foyer, a soft hand touched my arm. I turned. It was Sarah. My sister looked immaculate as always. She had managed to stay on the periphery during the chaos, distancing herself from Arthur and Edward the moment the handcuffs came out. Now she was looking at me with wide, doe-like eyes, trembling slightly. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling with a carefully calibrated mixture of fear and affection. "Oh my God! I can't believe they did those things. It is horrible." She squeezed my arm. "I am so glad you're okay," she said, attempting a smile. "You know I never hated you. You know that, right? I was just scared of Dad. He forced me to be mean to you. He made me say those things, but deep down I always admired you. I always knew you were special." She stepped closer, the scent of her expensive perfume cloying and sweet. "We are the only ones left now, Richard," she purred. "We have to stick together. You are going to need someone to help you manage the estate, to help you navigate society. I can do that. I can be your hostess. We can rebuild the family name, just you and me." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had mocked my clothes an hour ago, the woman who had told me I was an embarrassment. She wasn't sorry. She was just calculating the odds. She saw that the power had shifted, and she was trying to secure her berth on the new flagship. I gently removed her hand from my arm, as if I were removing a leech. "Sarah," I said, my voice flat. "Yes, brother?" she asked, hopeful. "You have 24 hours, I said. Her smile faltered. "What? 24 hours for what?" "To get your things and get out," I said. Her eyes went wide. "Richard, you can't be serious. This is my home. I have nowhere to go. My friends, my reputation." "Your reputation is built on money that was stolen from sick children and poisoned land," I said. "You were on the board of directors for the charity, Sarah. I saw your signature on the meeting minutes. You voted to approve the consulting fees for Edward. You are not innocent. You are just lucky the prosecutor offered you immunity in exchange for testimony." She paled. She didn't know I knew that. "I am giving you a grace period because you are my sister," I said, pointing toward the massive front doors where the flashing lights were still pulsating. "But that grace expires tomorrow at midnight. If you are still on this property at 12:01, I will have you removed for trespassing. And unlike Arthur, I won't pay for your legal fees." "But how will I live?" She stammered, tears of genuine self-pity springing to her eyes. "I have never worked a day in my life." "Then I suggest you start tomorrow," I said. "I hear there is a construction site downtown looking for laborers. They pay $15 an hour. It is honest work. You might find it refreshing." I turned my back on her. I didn't wait for her response. I walked away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the ruined party, a princess, without a castle, finally forced to face the world, without a safety net. The ballroom was emptying out. The guests were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. The music had stopped. The champagne was warm. And for the first time in 40 years, the air in the Sterling mansion felt breathable. The last of the police cruisers had faded into the distance, their sirens merely a red pulsation against the night sky. The guests had fled hours ago, scattering like cockroaches when the kitchen light is flipped on, leaving behind half-eaten canapes and spilled wine that stained the expensive Persian rugs like blood. The silence that descended on the Sterling estate was not peaceful. It was heavy. It was the silence of a tomb after the grave robbers have left. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, listening to the hum of the industrial vacuum cleaners. A cleaning crew, paid for by me in advance, was already moving through the ballroom, sweeping up the confetti that was supposed to celebrate a coronation, but instead marked a funeral. They moved efficiently, their faces blank. To them, this was just another job. To me, they were scrubbing away the last sticky residue of my father's ego. I turned away from the noise and walked up the grand staircase. My boots, still dusty from the day's work, thudded softly against the plush carpet runner. I ran my hand along the mahogany banister. It was cold. Everything in this house was cold. It was designed to impress, not to comfort. I reached the second floor and walked past the master suite. The door was open, revealing the chaos of the police search. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered. It looked like a storm had passed through a museum. I felt no urge to go in. There were no ghosts in there for me, only the stale smell of Arthur's cigars and the lies he told himself in the mirror every morning. I walked further down the hall to the north wing. This was the servants' quarters in the original architectural plans, but it was where my room had been, the farthest point from the master bedroom, the exile zone. I pushed the door open. It creaked, a rusty protest against being disturbed. The room was unrecognizable. It was no longer a bedroom. It had become a dumping ground. Stacks of old magazines, broken furniture boxes of unwanted holiday decorations, and moth-eaten coats filled the space. The bed where I had dreamed of building skyscrapers was gone, buried under a pile of discarded curtains. The desk where I had drawn my first blueprints was likely firewood now. I navigated through the maze of junk, the air thick with dust and neglect. This room was a physical manifestation of how they saw me, a storage unit for things they did not want but were too lazy to throw away. Then I saw it. Tucked in the corner, wedged between a broken floor lamp and a box of Christmas ornaments, was a small, battered wooden chest. My heart skipped a beat. It was a toy chest I had built myself when I was 12. It was crude, the corners uneven, the varnish bubbly, but it was mine. I had made it with scraps of wood I stole from the gardener's shed. I knelt down, ignoring the grime on my knees, and pried the lid open. It was mostly empty. The mice had gotten to the few comic books I had hidden there. But at the bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a single object, a model bridge. It was made of popsicle sticks and glue. I picked it up. It was fragile, yellowed with age, but the structure held. I remembered building this. I remembered testing it with dictionaries to see how much weight it could bear. It had held 3 encyclopedias. I held the little bridge in my large, calloused hands. It was the only thing in this 20,000-square-foot mansion that had any soul. It was the artifact of the boy who had died in this house so that the man could survive. "Hello, kid," I whispered to the empty room. "We made it." I tucked the bridge into the deep pocket of my work coat. I didn't need anything else. The rest of this, the furniture, the art, the memories, could rot. I walked back downstairs. The cleaning crew had moved to the patio. The house was quiet again. I found my mother in the living room. Evelyn Sterling was sitting on the white silk sofa, staring at the fireplace. The fire had gone out hours ago, leaving only gray ash, but she didn't seem to notice. She was still wearing her gown, but she had taken off her shoes. Her feet looked swollen and pale. The diamond necklace was gone, likely seized by the agents as potential evidence or hidden in her pocket, but she clutched her handbag like a life preserver. She looked small. Without Arthur's booming presence to reflect light onto her, she seemed to have dimmed like a moon without a sun. I walked in and stood by the fireplace. I didn't sit. I didn't want to get comfortable. She looked up. Her eyes were red and puffy, the makeup streaked in jagged lines down her cheeks. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and confusion, as if she were trying to reconcile the boy she remembered with the stranger who had just dismantled her life. "They took him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They put him in handcuffs, Richard. Like a common criminal." "He is a criminal, Mom," I said gently. "Common or uncommon, the law does not care." She shook her head, a spasm of denial. "He is your father. How could you do this? How could you humiliate us like that? In front of everyone?" "I did not humiliate him," I replied. "I just turned on the lights. The humiliation was there all along. You just refused to look at it." She looked down at her hands, twisting a ring on her finger. "We are family, Richard. Families protect each other. No matter what." I felt a surge of old anger, but I tamped it down. Anger was useless now. This was just an autopsy. "Family?" I asked. "Is that what we were? When Arthur cut off my tuition, was that family? When you watched him burn my sketchbooks because architects are just glorified bricklayers, was that family?" She flinched. "I was scared. You do not understand." "He has a temper." "I know he has a temper," I said. "I still have the scars on my back from the time I dropped his golf clubs. I know exactly who he is. The question is, why did you stay?" "I had nowhere to go," she sobbed. "I have never worked. I do not know how to do anything. I needed him." "And that is the tragedy, isn't it?" I said, looking around the opulent room. "You traded your freedom for this house. You traded your son for a credit card." "That is not true," she cried, looking up with a flash of defiance. "I loved you. I sent you money." "You sent me hush money," I corrected her. "You sent me money so you could sleep at night, not so I could eat. And when I tried to send money back to save your life, you let him steal it to buy a watch." She went silent. She knew I was right. The truth hung between us, heavy and undeniable. "Why are you so cruel?" she whispered, wiping her nose with a silk handkerchief. "Why do you have to be so cruel?" I sighed. I looked at this woman, this fragile broken bird, who had spent 40 years in a golden cage, and I realized I couldn't hate her. I just couldn't respect her. "Cruelty," I said, my voice low and steady, "is watching your 16-year-old son beg to be let out of a locked room and going shopping, because the crying is ruining your mood. Cruelty is letting your husband tell the world your son is a junkie to protect your social standing. I am not being cruel, Mother. I am being fair. For the first time in this house's history, I am being absolutely fair." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small navy blue bank book. I walked over and placed it on the coffee table in front of her. It sat there, a small, unassuming object against the marble surface. She looked at it, then at me. "What is this?" "That is the account I set up for you 5 years ago," I said. "The one Arthur stole from. I replenished it. There is $200,000 in there." Her eyes widened. She reached out and touched the book with a trembling finger. "200,000? "It is not a fortune," I said. "It is not enough to buy Hermes bags or host galas. But it is enough. It is enough to get you a room in a very nice assisted living facility, or to rent a modest apartment in a quiet town. It is enough to keep you fed and warm for the rest of your life if you are careful." She looked at the book, then up at me, tears welling fresh in her eyes. "Richard the First." "But there is a condition," I cut her off. She froze. "What condition?" "You take that book and you go," I said. "You leave Virginia, go to Florida, go to Arizona. I do not care. But you never contact me again." She gasped, clutching her chest. "Richard, no. You are my son." "I was your son," I said. "But that boy died a long time ago. You let him die. The man standing here is just the executor of the estate." I turned and walked toward the door. I couldn't look at her anymore. It was like looking at a ruin. "Richard," she called out, her voice desperate. "Do not leave me here alone. It is so big, it is so quiet." I stopped in the doorway. "Get used to the quiet, Mom. It is the only thing that is real in this house." I walked out of the living room, leaving her weeping on the sofa, clutching the passbook that was her severance package from motherhood. I walked to the front door. The heavy oak felt solid under my hand. I stepped out onto the porch. The night air was crisp and clean, scrubbing the scent of stale perfume and old lies from my lungs. A man was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps. He was wearing a sharp gray suit. It was Mr. Henderson, the former CFO who Arthur had framed. I had hired him back as soon as I bought the debt. He looked tired, but he was smiling. "Mr. Johnson," Henderson said, extending his hand. "Mr. Henderson," I replied, shaking it firmly. "Is everything ready?" "Yes, sir," he said. "The deed transfer is recorded. The locks are being changed as we speak. The security team has new orders." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the master key ring, the heavy brass set that Arthur used to wear on his belt like a jailer's keys. I had taken them from the valet stand. I dropped the keys into Henderson's hand. They jingled a metallic death rattle of the Sterling dynasty. "Sell it," I said. Henderson blinked. "Sir, the market is a bit volatile right now given the arrests." "I do not care about the price," I said. "Sell it all. The furniture, the art, the cars, the house itself. Strip it down to the studs if you have to." "And the proceeds?" Henderson asked, pulling out a notepad. "Where should I route the funds? To RJ Holdings?" "No," I said, looking back at the looming shadow of the mansion. It looked like a mausoleum against the night sky. "I do not want a single cent of blood money in my accounts. Donate it." "Donate it?" "Create a scholarship fund," I said, "for children from low-income families who want to study architecture and engineering. Full rides, tuition, room board, and supplies. Call it the Builder's Grant. And make sure the first checks go out before the trial starts." Henderson smiled a genuine warm smile. "That is very generous, Richard. It will change a lot of lives." "It is not generosity," I said, turning away from the house. "It is fumigation. I am cleaning the slate." I walked past the row of luxury cars that were now technically mine, the Ferraris, the Bentleys. I didn't even glance at them. I walked straight to the edge of the manicured lawn where my truck was parked. The Ford F-150 looked beautiful in the moonlight. It was dented. It was scratched. The bumper was held on with duct tape in one spot. But it was honest. Every scratch told a story of hard work. Every dent was a badge of honor. I opened the door. The familiar smell of sawdust, old coffee, and diesel greeted me. It smelled like home. I climbed into the driver's seat. The suspension creaked under my weight. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, a rough, coughing sound that settled into a steady, reliable purr. I looked out the window one last time. I saw Henderson walking up the steps to lock the doors. I saw the lights in the living room go out as my mother finally went upstairs to pack. The Sterling estate was dark. The monster was dead. I put the truck in gear. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me that I needed. I drove down the long, winding driveway, past the iron gates that had been meant to keep the world out, but had only served to keep the rot in. I turned onto the main road, the tires humming on the asphalt. I was 40 years old. I had no family. I had no home to go back to tonight. I would probably sleep in a motel off the interstate. But as I accelerated, watching the speedometer climb, 40, 50, 60, I felt a sensation I hadn't felt in 20 years. I felt light. I reached into my pocket and touched the popsicle stick bridge. It was still there. Broken, but still there. "We are going to build something new," I whispered to the empty cab. "And this time the foundation is going to be solid." I drove into the night, leaving the name Sterling in the dust where it belonged. The calendar on the wall of the construction trailer says it is July exactly 6 months, Since the night I walked out of the Sterling mansion with nothing but a model bridge in my pocket and a fire in my soul. The Virginia summer is in full swing. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of pine resin. But up here on this hill, there is a breeze that tastes like pure oxygen. I am standing on a ridge overlooking a sprawling 4-acre lot on the outskirts of Richmond. It used to be a derelict rail yard, a scar on the landscape filled with rusted metal and weeds. Now it is alive. Below me, the skeleton of a massive timber frame structure is rising from the earth. It is not a mansion. It is not a monument to ego. It is the future home of the Open Door Arts and Technology Center. It is a tuition-free school and community hub for at-risk youth. It is a place where kids who are told they are losers or distractions can come to learn coding, carpentry, music, and architecture. It is the place I wished existed when I was 16 years old and locking myself in the attic to escape my father's voice. A portable radio is playing on the tailgate of a nearby pickup truck. The news anchor's voice drifts up the hill, mixing with the rhythmic banging of hammers and the whine of circular saws. Breaking news, the anchor announces, his voice grave. Former real estate mogul Arthur Sterling has been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. His son, Edward Sterling, received a 15-year sentence for his role in the charity fraud scheme. The judge called their actions a systemic betrayal of the public trust. The Sterling Group has officially filed for Chapter 7 liquidation as of this morning. I listened to the words. They should feel heavy. They should feel like a triumphant climax to a war movie. But honestly, they just sound like the weather report. It is just information. It is a fact like the temperature or the time of day. Arthur is going to prison. The empire is dust. I take a sip of lukewarm coffee from my thermos. I feel remarkably light. There is no surge of adrenaline, no desire to pump my fist in the air. That part of my life, the part that was defined by them, is over. It is like closing a book that you didn't enjoy reading. You do not think about the characters after you put it on the shelf. I am not wearing a suit today. I am wearing a pair of faded denim jeans covered in sawdust and a plain black t-shirt that costs $10. My boots are muddy, my hands are rough, and I have never felt more powerful in my life. "Hey, Richard!" I turn to see Maya walking up the hill. Maya is the lead structural engineer on this project. She is brilliant, fierce, and entirely unimpressed by money. She was the one who figured out how to use recycled steel for the roof trusses to keep us under budget. "Mail call," she says, tossing a white envelope toward me. "Courier just dropped it off. Said it was urgent." I catch the envelope. It is heavy. I look at the return address. It is stamped in red ink, Department of Corrections, of inmate number 8, 9402. It is from Arthur. Maya watches me, her expression guarded. She knows who I am. She knows the story. The whole world knows the story now. But she doesn't treat me like a victim, and she doesn't treat me like a millionaire. She treats me like a colleague. "Do you want a minute?" she asks. I look at the envelope. I can see the handwriting on the front. It is shaky. It is the handwriting of a man who has lost control of his hands, his life, and his narrative. I wonder briefly what is inside. Is it an apology? Is it a curse? Is he begging for money? Is he trying to manipulate me one last time with a story about how he did it all for me? For a split second, curiosity scratches at the back of my mind. But then I look down at the construction site. I see a group of teenagers walking through the frame of the building, wearing hard hats, their eyes wide with wonder, as a foreman explains how the load-bearing walls work. I see the future. The envelope is the past. And the past has nothing left to teach me. I reach into my pocket and pull out a silver Zippo lighter. I flick the wheel. The flame jumps up orange and eager against the blue sky. "No," I say to Maya. I do not need a minute. I touch the flame to the corner of the envelope. The paper catches instantly. I hold it by the corner, watching the fire consume the stamp, the return address, and the inmate number. The flames eat away the name Arthur Sterling, until it is nothing but black ash curling in the wind. I do not feel anger. I do not feel sad. I feel a profound sense of cleaning. It is the final fumigation. I hold onto the burning letter until the heat stings my fingertips. Then I let it drop to the dirt. I step on the ashes, grinding them into the mud with the heel of my work boot. Maya smiles. It is a small, knowing smile. "Good," she says. "Because we have a problem with the skylights in the atrium. The glass shipment is delayed. We need a workaround." "I was thinking we could use polycarbonate panels," I say, falling instantly back into the rhythm of the work. "They are lighter, cheaper, and they diffuse the light better for the art studios." "I like it," she says, turning back toward the site. "Come on, the team is waiting for you." I walk down the hill with her. I am not Richard Sterling, the disappointed son. I am not Richard Johnson, the Avenger. I am just Richard, the builder. We spend the next 3 hours debating structural loads and light angles. I argue with the plumber about the pipe routing. I laugh with the electricians over a bad joke. I eat a sandwich sitting on a stack of drywall. These people do not care about my last name. They respect me because I know how to read a blueprint. They respect me because I show up first in the morning and leave last at night. They respect me because I pay them on time and I treat them like human beings. This is what Arthur never understood. Respect is not something you buy or inherit. It is something you build brick by brick. As the sun begins to set, painting the Virginia sky in streaks of purple and gold, the crew starts to pack up. The noise of the machinery dies down, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. I stay behind for a moment. I walk to the center of the unfinished atrium. The roof isn't on yet, so I can see the first stars beginning to twinkle above the steel beams. I take a deep breath. The air smells of wet earth and potential. I turn and look directly at you. Yes, you, the person listening to this story. The person who has been with me from the cold parking lot to the spotlight of the ballroom. I need you to understand something. They called me a loser. For 20 years that word was a cage. It defined where I could go, who I could talk to, and what I could dream. They told me that because I didn't have their money, their suits, or their cruelty, I was worth nothing. But here is the truth I learned in the fire. Truth I learned. Do not ever let the definition of another person become your reality. People like Arthur and Edward, they try to make you small, so they can feel big. They try to convince you that the game they are playing is the only game in town. But you can flip the board. They called me a loser because I didn't play by their rules. But looking back, I realized that losing their game was the only way to win my life. Real victory isn't about destroying your enemies. I could have crushed them harder. I could have taken the money. I could have bought the yacht and the watch and lived in that mansion. But if I had done that, I would have just become Arthur with a different name. The greatest victory is not beating them. It is not becoming them. I look around at the beams of the school rising around me. This is my victory. Not the destruction of the Sterling Empire, but the construction of this. I smile. It is not the scary, cold smile I gave Arthur in the ballroom. It is a smile that reaches my eyes. It is warm. It is real. It is the smile of a man who owns his own soul. My name is Richard Johnson, I say to the silence, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I turn my back on the camera. I walk away, moving toward the horizon, where the sun will rise again tomorrow. My shadow stretches out behind me long and unbroken. I do not look back. I just keep walking one step at a time into a future that belongs entirely to me. The screen fades to black, leaving only white text glowing in the center. Your value is in your hands, not in the mouths of others. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It has been a long journey from the shadows of that mansion to the freedom of this hill, and I am grateful you walked it with me. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Are you in a city, a quiet town, or maybe on a job site of your own? Please leave a comment below and share your location and your thoughts on Richard's choice. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to Calm Revenge Stories and liking this video. And if you really want to support us so we can bring more stories like this to the world, please hit that hype button. It helps more than you know. Stay strong and remember, you define your own worth.